What happens when a prejudiced man in a MAGA hat crosses paths with a black man? Oblivious to the fact he's confronting the town's mayor, prepare yourself for a gripping tale that may resonate deeply with many. On an ordinary afternoon, the rhythmic buzz of life filled the air as Mayor James Parker casually walked into a suburban supermarket. Dressed in a simple button-up shirt and well-worn jeans, he blended seamlessly with the other shoppers, his cart already partially stocked. For James, small errands like this were a cherished escape, a fleeting moment of normalcy away from the high-pressure demands of city leadership. Near the self-checkout counters by the store's entrance, a man donning a vivid red MAGA cap made an unmistakable impression. With his phone pressed firmly to his ear and gestures animated, Doug Simmons's voice sliced through the store's ambient chatter like a sharp blade. "I'm telling you!" Doug's words boomed, his tone dismissive and unapologetically loud. "This country's gone to the dogs. You can't take two steps without someone who doesn't belong here calling the shots." Doug's glance flickered toward James briefly, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of disdain before he turned back to his groceries. "Even this guy probably thinks he's running the show now," he muttered, his tone intentionally casual, yet dripping with venomous judgment. James's hand paused mid-air as he reached for a loaf of bread to scan, the comment landing like a slap. Straightening his posture, his calm but firm voice sliced through the air, carrying enough weight to still the murmurs around them. "Excuse me," he began, his tone resolute, "but perhaps you should think twice before saying something like that in front of me or anyone else." Doug's gaze shifted back to James, his smirk widening with condescension. "Relax, buddy. It's just a joke. You people are always so touchy," Doug retorted, waving a dismissive hand. James's jaw tightened, but his measured voice betrayed no anger, only resolve. "And people like you," he countered, his words pointed, "always think they can say whatever they want under the guise of humor." Nearby shoppers began to slow their movements. Their curiosity piqued as the charged exchange unfolded. The atmosphere was electric, with a tension that drew onlookers like moths to a flame. Doug's bravado wavered momentarily as James's unwavering stance drew the attention of the surrounding crowd. "Why don't you just mind your own business?" Doug snapped, his voice tinged with frustration. James allowed a faint smile to tug at the corner of his lips. "When your business involves ignorance and hate, it becomes everyone's business," he replied coolly. Doug's glare deepened, his phone now an afterthought in his hand. "Oh, aren't you just the hero of the day?" he sneered. The seeds of confrontation had firmly taken root, transforming the once innocuous grocery checkout into an unanticipated battleground. Doug leaned against his self-checkout kiosk, his derisive laughter grating against the nerves of those around him. "I'm just saying what everyone else is too afraid to admit. This country's been catering to people who think they're owed everything. I bet you're all about that, aren't you?" James inhaled deeply, centering himself as he maintained his steady demeanor. "You know nothing about me," he stated, his tone even. "But let me offer you some advice. Choose your next words carefully." Doug's smirk widened as he leaned closer, his MAGA hat tilted slightly askew. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I hurt your feelings? You people love playing the victim, don't you?" A ripple of unease spread through the gathered shoppers. A woman subtly angled her phone, capturing the unfolding drama, while Kendra, the store's attendant, hovered nervously by the service phone, her eyes darting between the two men. James's jaw clenched imperceptibly, but his tone remained unshakable. "Victim? No, Doug, that's where you've got it wrong. People like me, we're survivors. We've endured people like you for generations." For the first time, Doug's smug exterior began to crack. His eyes darted around, realizing that the crowd's collective gaze was now fixed solely on him. "Oh, look at you," he sneered, attempting to mask his discomfort with bravado. "Got yourself a little audience. Must feel good stirring up trouble in the middle of a store." "You're the one causing a scene," James countered, gesturing subtly toward Doug's half-scanned items. "Maybe you should focus on completing your checkout instead of making a fool of yourself." A soft chuckle rippled through the onlookers, further deepening the flush of anger spreading across Doug's face. "Don't get cocky," he growled. "You don't know who you're messing with." James's faint smile returned, his calm confidence unshaken. "Funny," he said, his tone low but resonant. "I was about to say the same to you." Doug's glare darkened, his fists clenching tightly at his sides, as his voice boomed once again, pulling every nearby eye toward him. "The truth?" he spat, his tone laced with disdain. "The truth is, you're nothing. You think you've got it rough? Try being a white man in this country today. Nobody gives a damn about us anymore." His words rippled through the room like a stone tossed into a still pond, eliciting murmurs from the gathering crowd. Kendra, the store associate, took a hesitant step forward, her voice firmer now as she addressed him. "Sir," she said, a note of authority cutting through her hesitation, "this is not the place for that kind of behavior. If you don't calm down or leave, I'll have to call security." Doug whipped around to face her, his voice rising further. "Call them. I've done nothing wrong. This guy's the one causing a scene, strutting around like he owns the place." James let out a dry, humorless chuckle, crossing his arms as he responded with razor-sharp wit. "Coming from the guy yelling at a store clerk and holding up the line, that's rich." Doug's face turned a deep shade of purple, the rage simmering within him almost tangible. He took a step closer to James, their faces nearly nose to nose, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're clever, don't you? Walking around like you're untouchable? Let me tell you something. You're not. Guys like me built this country, and we'll take it back." James raised a single brow, his voice unwavering and laced with calm confidence. "Take it back? Doug, people like you are the reason it needs taking back in the first place." A collective gasp swept through the crowd, a few nervous chuckles breaking the tension as Doug's pride visibly fractured under the weight of the remark. His face twisted in anger, his body tense as if on the verge of exploding. Yet, the presence of onlookers seemed to hold him back, his hands twitching at his sides like they were itching for a fight he wasn't sure he could win. Kendra, her voice quieter but still steady, turned her attention to James. "Do you want me to call someone?" she asked cautiously. "He looks like he's about to lose it." James shook his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Doug's. "Not yet," he said, his tone measured. "He'll either back down or dig himself into a deeper hole." Doug muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he glared at James. "You don't scare me," he growled. James's reply was cool and composed, yet carried the weight of unshakable resolve. "I don't need to scare you. The truth has a way of doing that, all on its own." The atmosphere thickened, the confrontation teetering on the edge of escalation. Though no punches had been thrown, the threat of violence loomed heavy in the air. Doug's sneer widened, his face a mask of mockery and simmering rage as he leaned closer to James. "You've got a lot to say for someone who doesn't know when to shut up," he hissed. James stood firm, his posture relaxed but unyielding. "And you've got a lot of anger for someone who walked in here without a reason to be mad," James countered, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. Doug barked a laugh, the sound grating and filled with malice. "You think I'm mad? No, I'm tired. Tired of people like you walking around like you own the place." James tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but incisive. "And what exactly do you think I own, Doug? Common sense? Decency? I'd be happy to lend you some if that's what you're lacking." A ripple of stifled laughter spread through the crowd, the tension momentarily broken as Doug's face turned an even deeper shade of red. His fists clenched tightly at his sides as he glared at the onlookers, realizing he was now the center of attention. "Laugh it up!" he snarled, his voice rising. "You don't scare me. You're just another loudmouth who doesn't know his place." James's expression hardened, but his voice remained steady. "And where exactly do you think my place is, Doug? Because the way I see it, my place is anywhere I choose to stand." Doug's bravado faltered for a moment, his smirk slipping as James's words landed with precision. He stepped closer, his chest puffed out in a futile attempt to reclaim dominance. "Your place is somewhere else, somewhere far away from people like me, the ones who built this country." James exhaled sharply, a bitter chuckle escaping him. "Built this country? You mean people like you, who think they're owed something just for showing up?" Doug took another step forward, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. You think you're better than me? James met Doug's gaze unflinchingly, his words cutting like steel. No, Doug. I don't think I'm better than you. I just refuse to sink to your level. Doug's breath hitched, his eyes darting nervously to the crowd of onlookers. The flashing red lights of recording phones were impossible to miss, and his fury mixed with embarrassment as he turned back to James. You think you're so clever, Doug spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Standing here, mouthing off while everyone watches. James's voice sharpened, slicing through the mounting tension. Clever enough to know when someone's picking a fight they can't win. Doug's hand twitched at his side, a flicker of movement that hinted at his inner conflict. But instead of striking, he slammed his hand onto the self-checkout station, causing the machine to rattle under the force of his frustration. You're real smug for someone who doesn't belong here, Doug snarled, his voice thick with contempt. James raised an eyebrow, his reply calm but pointed. Doesn't belong here? Funny. I don't recall asking for your permission to buy groceries. Kendra stepped forward again, her voice firm and unwavering. Sir, she said, addressing Doug directly, if you're not going to check out, you'll need to leave. Doug turned to her, his voice dripping with disdain. Why don't you mind your own business, sweetheart? Stick to bagging groceries or whatever it is you do here. James's fists tightened, but his tone remained unshaken as he cut through Doug's tirade. That's enough. You're angry. You're embarrassed. And now you're trying to take it out on everyone around you. But trust me, Doug, no one here is impressed. Doug's face twisted with fury as he turned back to James. You think you're so tough, don't you? Hiding behind your words, acting like nothing can touch you. James took a single step forward, closing the space between them as he delivered his final blow. Tough? No, Doug. Tough is standing up to bullies like you and refusing to let them have the last word. Doug's breath came in ragged bursts, his hand twitching at his side, and the suffocating silence in the room pressed down like a heavy weight. All eyes were locked on the unfolding drama, the crowd immobilized by the intensity of the scene. Kendra's trembling fingers hovered over the store phone, her wide eyes darting nervously between Doug and James as she braced herself for the inevitable eruption. You know what? Doug spat, his voice cracking with anger as he stepped forward. His movements were sharp, his body tense like a coiled spring ready to snap. I've had enough of this, he lunged, shoving James squarely in the chest. The force sent James staggering back a step, but he didn't falter. Instead, he straightened, locking eyes with Doug, his gaze filled with a calm, steady intensity. Big mistake, James said softly, his tone low and dangerous, each word deliberate. Doug smirked, taking a half-step back, his bravado flaring. What are you going to do about it? Call the cops? Go ahead. You're nothing. Nobody's going to listen to you anyway. Kendra, now visibly shaken, raised the phone to her ear. I'm calling security, she declared, her voice quivering but resolute. James lifted a hand, his eyes never leaving Doug's. Not yet, he said firmly. Let him bury himself. Doug let out a bitter laugh, his shoulders shaking with misplaced confidence. You've got nothing on me. Standing there all smug like you're better than me doesn't make it true. James's voice was even, his composure unshaken. What makes me better than you, Doug, is that I don't need to throw punches to make a point. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, the shared tension holding them captive. Doug's face twisted in fury, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain himself, his hands flexed, his body trembling with barely contained rage. The room's silence felt deafening, broken only by the occasional mechanical beep of a self-checkout machine. But no one cared about groceries anymore. You think this is funny? Doug barked suddenly, his voice loud and shrill, pitching higher with every word. You think you're better than me? Standing there acting righteous while these people record me like I'm the bad guy? Turn those damn cameras off. He gestured wildly at the onlookers, his voice growing more erratic with every syllable. James's expression didn't change. His hands relaxed at his sides. His voice, calm and unyielding, sliced through Doug's tirade. No one asked you to act like this, Doug. You're the one making a spectacle of yourself. Doug jabbed a finger at James, his face flushed with anger. You don't get to talk down to me. You think you're smarter than me? Better than me? Well, let me tell you something. You're not. You're just another—" He stopped short, his mouth curling into a cruel sneer. "Never mind. You know exactly what you are." James's jaw tightened, but he refused to rise to the bait. Instead, he spoke evenly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs in the room. "Go ahead, Doug. Say it. Let everyone here see exactly who you are." Doug's face turned a deep, angry red, his fists trembling at his sides. He threw his hands up in frustration, his voice rising again. "This is what's wrong with this damn country. People like you walking around thinking you can do whatever you want, acting like you're untouchable. Well, guess what? You're not." Kendra gripped the phone tightly, her knuckles white, but she held her ground. "Sir," she said firmly, her voice louder now, "you need to leave, or I'll call security right now." Doug spun toward her, his anger spilling over. "Shut up! You don't tell me what to do. I'm not going anywhere until I'm damn good and ready." James stepped forward, his voice dropping to a chilling calm. "That's enough," he said, his words razor-sharp. "You don't get to yell at her. You don't get to bully anyone here. If you can't control yourself, leave before you make this worse for yourself." Doug turned back to James, his expression wild with fury. "Worse for myself?" he sneered. "You don't get to tell me what to do? Who do you think you are, huh? Smarter than me? Better than me?" James's gaze didn't waver, his tone hardening. "Smarter than someone making a fool of himself in front of a crowd? Absolutely." A few chuckles rippled through the onlookers, their nervous laughter punctuating the charged atmosphere. Doug's face twisted, his fists clenching and unclenching as he seethed. "You're nothing!" he shouted, his voice shrill and irrational. "You think you can make me look bad? No, that's not how this works. I'm not the problem. You are. People like you are the problem." James's voice cut through Doug's rant, calm but commanding. "People like me? Say it, Doug. Tell us what you mean." Doug's lips curled into a sneer, his words venomous. "You know exactly what I mean. You people always playing the victim, always making it about race. You get everything handed to you while guys like me work for it. And then you have the nerve to lecture me." The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog, a collective gasp spreading through the room. Kendra took a small step back, her hand shaking as she clutched the phone. James tilted his head slightly, his voice low and deliberate. "You've spent this whole time yelling and screaming, showing everyone here exactly who you are. And you have the nerve to call me entitled? Doug, you're not just embarrassing yourself. You're proving to everyone why things are the way they are. And guess what? It's not because of people like me." Doug's entire body trembled, his fists tight as his fury reached its peak. Then, with a sudden explosive motion, he lunged forward. His fist collided with James's jaw in a sickening thud that echoed through the store. The crowd gasped, several stepping forward instinctively, but James raised a hand to stop them. Straightening slowly, James met Doug's wild-eyed gaze. His expression was calm, his voice steady despite the red mark blooming on his jaw. "You really just did that," he said quietly, disbelief coloring his words. Doug stood frozen, his chest heaving, his fist still clenched, as the reality of his actions began to sink in. Doug stood motionless for a fraction of a second, his breathing labored, glaring at James like a predator cornered by its prey. His eyes burned with defiance, but the weight of the crowd's silence pressed heavy against him. Kendra, her hands trembling, didn't hesitate this time. She raised the store phone to her ear, her voice shaky but resolute. "We need security and police at the front immediately," she said, her words slicing through the oppressive quiet. Doug's smirk returned, though it wavered under the weight of his actions. "Go ahead," he muttered, the bravado in his voice faltering. "Call them. I don't care." James, wiping the corner of his mouth where a small smear of blood had formed, locked his gaze on Doug. His voice was low, but carried the gravity of the moment. "Big mistake, Doug. Big mistake." The room's atmosphere shifted. As the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in, the murmurs of the crowd fell silent, every eye trained on Doug as hurried footsteps echoed through the aisles. Two security guards approached the scene, their presence signaling an end to the escalating chaos. The first guard, a broad-shouldered man with a crisp badge pinned to his chest, quickly assessed the situation, the visible mark on James's jaw, Doug's trembling fists, and the uneasy crowd. "Sir, step back," the guard barked, his voice firm and commanding as he zeroed in on Doug. Doug spun to face the guards, his expression a volatile mix of anger and panic. "Oh, great! Mall cops, huh? What are you gonna do? Touch me? Go ahead. See what happens." His words dripped with defiance, but his trembling hands betrayed his inner turmoil. The second guard, a lean woman with piercing eyes, stepped forward, her tone equally authoritative. "Sir, calm down and keep your hands where we can see them. The police are on their way." Doug threw his arms wide in a theatrical display, waving them dramatically before jabbing a finger in James's direction. "What about him?" he yelled, his voice growing more frantic. "You better deal with him too. He started this whole thing, acting like he's untouchable." James stood firm, his gaze steady as he addressed Doug. "No one started anything except you. Everyone here saw it." "That's a lie," Doug shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. His desperation was palpable as he glanced at the crowd, hoping for support. "You're all against me. This is a setup. He's playing you, all of you." His words grew more erratic, nearly incoherent, as he gestured wildly. "You're just eating it up because he's got you brainwashed." The stocky guard stepped closer, his hand instinctively hovering near the baton at his hip. "Sir, this is your last warning. Step back and keep your hands visible." Doug laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy? That's rich. Just because he stood there running his mouth, I'm the one getting blamed? Unbelievable." The female guard exchanged a quick glance with her partner. "We need to restrain him until the police arrive. He's escalating." Doug's eyes widened in disbelief as the guards advanced. "Restrain me? For what? I didn't do anything wrong." His fists clenched, his entire body vibrating with barely contained fury. "You assaulted someone in front of witnesses," the male guard stated, his tone unyielding. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Doug roared, his voice echoing off the store's walls. "This is expletive. He provoked me. He pushed me to it. You're all on his side." His words dissolved into guttural noises as the guards closed the distance. The male guard seized Doug's arm, attempting to twist it behind his back, but Doug thrashed violently. "Get off me! Don't touch me! I'm not going anywhere." The female guard moved swiftly, grabbing his other arm. Together, they pinned Doug against the checkout station as his red MAGA hat tumbled to the floor. Doug's struggles intensified. "You're making a mistake. Do you know who I am? I'll sue every one of you. You can't treat me like this." "Stop resisting," the male guard barked, his grip tightening as Doug's face pressed against the cold plastic surface of the station. Doug's voice, muffled and frantic, rose again. "I'm not resisting. This is harassment. He's the one you should be arresting." James stood silently a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression calm despite the reddened mark on his jaw. The murmuring crowd buzzed with mixed emotions, shock, anger, and quiet satisfaction rippling through the onlookers. Kendra, still clutching the phone, spoke into it softly. "They've got him restrained now. Let the officers know." "Thanks." She hung up and turned to James, her voice tentative. "Are you okay?" That looked like it hurt. James nodded, offering her a faint smile. "I'm fine. I've dealt with worse. Thank you, Kendra. You handled that better than most would." Doug's muffled screams persisted as the guards tightened their grip. "You think this is over? It's not. You'll regret this. My lawyers will have your jobs." The female guard leaned in close, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, stop yelling. You're only making this worse for yourself. The more you fight, the harder it'll be." Doug let out one final guttural growl before his body went limp. His breathing was ragged, his face flushed a deep red, and his disheveled hair framed his wide, darting eyes. He scanned the room as if searching for validation in the faces of the onlookers, but found only judgment. The distant sound of sirens grew louder signaling the arrival of law enforcement. The male guard glanced toward the entrance. "The police are here. Let's keep him restrained until they take over." James exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned to Kendra. "Thank you for making that call," he said sincerely. "You did the right thing." Kendra gave him a tight-lipped smile, her voice soft but resolute. "Someone had to. People like him don't get to just walk away from this." The rising wail of sirens filled the air, growing louder as the police arrived, their presence signaling the culmination of the tension that had gripped the store. Doug, now restrained but still muttering curses under his breath, was about to face the full consequences of his actions under the scrutinizing eyes of the gathered crowd. Shoppers instinctively parted, clearing a path as two uniformed officers strode through the glass doors, their movements brisk and purposeful. Doug remained pinned against the checkout station, his defiance still flickering despite the firm grip of the security guards. The taller officer, whose commanding presence seemed to silence even the faintest murmurs, approached the scene. His eyes scanned the area quickly, landing on Doug, the guards, and finally on James, who stood nearby with his arms crossed, a quiet yet authoritative figure. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his tone professional and sharp. The male security guard straightened and spoke first, his voice steady. "This man assaulted a customer. He's been resisting ever since we intervened. Witnesses and video footage confirm the incident." Doug's head snapped up, his face red and shining with sweat. "That's a damn lie," he barked, his voice shaking with indignation. "I was provoked. He's the one who started it." He jerked his chin toward James, his voice rising to a shout. "They're all against me. This is a setup." The officer raised a hand, his tone firm but calm. "Sir, lower your voice. You'll have your chance to explain." He turned to the nearest onlookers. "Can anyone here confirm what happened?" Kendra stepped forward, her phone raised. "I saw everything," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the lingering tension. She pointed at Doug. "That man shoved and punched him." She glanced at James briefly before continuing. "He didn't provoke anything. I have video proof, if you need it." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd as several others nodded in support, offering their phones to the officers. The second officer, a younger woman with sharp, focused eyes, took one of the devices and reviewed the footage. Her expression hardened as she watched, and she turned to her partner. "It's clear. He's the aggressor." The first officer faced Doug again, his expression unreadable, but his voice resolute. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault. I need you to cooperate." Doug's eyes widened in disbelief, his voice cracking as he repeated, "Arrest? Arrest? Are you kidding me? For what? Defending myself?" His protests grew louder, but the officer ignored them, nodding to the security guards. "We'll take it from here." As the guards released their hold, Doug tried to twist away, but the officers moved swiftly, securing him in handcuffs with practiced efficiency. Doug squirmed and shouted, his voice filled with fury and desperation. "This is a joke! You're all in on this! This guy," he spat the words, glaring at James. "He's nobody! Just some punk who thinks he can push people like me around." James took a measured step forward, his presence commanding, as he met Doug's fiery gaze with calm composure. A faint smirk played on his lips. "Nobody, huh?" Doug snarled, doubling down on his misplaced defiance. "Damn right, you're just some arrogant little—" James reached into his pocket and produced a sleek business card, holding it delicately between two fingers. The light caught the embossed lettering as he handed it to the officer. The officer glanced at the card, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. He straightened, his demeanor shifting to one of respect. "Mayor Parker." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, murmurs spreading like wildfire as shoppers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Phones adjusted angles to capture the revelation as Doug froze, his jaw slack in stunned disbelief. What did he just say?" Doug stammered, his voice cracking. James crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "That's right, Doug. You just assaulted the mayor of this city." Doug's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. His face turned an alarming shade of crimson as he sputtered, "No! You're lying! This can't—" "Oh, it's true," James cut in smoothly, his tone razor-sharp. "You've spent the last 15 minutes shouting, digging yourself into a hole in front of an entire store full of witnesses, and now you've learned you couldn't have chosen a worse target for your tantrum." The officer adjusted his grip on Doug and turned to James. "Mayor Parker, would you like to press charges?" James didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. People like Doug need to learn that actions have consequences." Doug's defiance shattered as panic seeped into his voice. "You can't do this! You're making a big mistake. I didn't know who you were." James's expression didn't waver. "You didn't know, and you didn't care. But here's the thing, Doug. Ignorance isn't a defense. It's just part of the problem." The officers guided Doug toward the door, his protests echoing through the store. "This isn't over. You hear me? I'll sue. I'll ruin you all." His voice faded as the doors swung shut behind him. The tension that had gripped the store dissolved into murmurs and scattered applause. Kendra approached James hesitantly, her voice filled with admiration. "You handled that better than anyone else could have. Are you okay?" James turned to her, his smile warm. "I'm fine. Thank you for stepping in when it mattered. You made sure this didn't spiral further." The crowd gradually dispersed, though many lingered to thank James or process the unexpected turn of events. James returned to the self-checkout station, picking up the loaf of bread he had dropped earlier. As he scanned it, he murmured to himself, loud enough for Kendra to hear, "Now, where was I?" The store's fluorescent lights dimmed slightly as James exited into the parking lot. He paused, watching the police cruiser carrying Doug's speed away, the man's muffled protests barely audible through the glass. A faint ache in his jaw reminded him of the punch, but as he stood there, his shoulders relaxed, and a quiet confidence emanated from him. The wail of sirens faded into the distance as James focused on what lay ahead. Sliding into the passenger seat of his car, he adjusted his tie, his faint smile hinting at quiet satisfaction. "Take me to the station," he instructed the driver. The ride was swift, and before long, James stepped into the bustling police station. The hum of activity, the ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and clipped voices was punctuated by one unmistakable sound, Doug's furious rant echoing from the holding area. "This isn't fair!" Doug's voice rang out, raw and agitated. "You people don't know who you're dealing with. I've got connections. You'll regret this." James approached the duty officer at the front desk. The officer straightened immediately, his expression a mix of respect and surprise. "Mayor Parker," he greeted, his voice tinged with deference. "The suspect is in holding. We've gathered witness statements, video evidence, and security reports. Charges are being processed." "Good," James replied evenly. "I'd like to see him." The officer hesitated momentarily, then gestured down the hall. "Right this way, sir." As James moved closer to the holding area, Doug's voice grew louder, a chaotic blend of insults and self-pity. "This is a setup. That guy provoked me. You're all going to pay when my lawyers get involved." James stepped into view, his hands casually tucked into his pockets, his face unreadable. Doug froze mid-rant, his expression morphing from fury to disbelief as their eyes met. "You!" Doug spat, rushing toward the bars. "What the hell are you doing here? Come to gloat?" James stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly. "Not at all, Doug. I'm here to ensure everything is handled properly. Accountability is important. Don't you agree?" Doug gripped the bars tightly, his knuckles whitening as his face flushed. "Accountability? You've got some nerve. This is your fault. You provoked me." James raised an eyebrow, his tone calm and unyielding. "Doug, you threw the punch. You shouted racial slurs in a public space. All I did was stand there and let you show everyone exactly who you are." Doug's face darkened, his voice dropping to a growl. "You don't know who you're messing with. I own Simmons Construction. Do you have any idea how much money I make? How many people I employ? I've got a multi-million-dollar bid with the city right now. You think this little stunt is going to stop me?" James chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "Doug, I know exactly who you are. I knew the moment you started shouting in that store." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make Doug lean in. "And that bid you're so proud of? I reviewed it personally." Doug's smirk faltered, a flicker of unease creeping into his expression. What are you saying?" James straightened, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm saying your actions tonight aren't just an embarrassment to you. They're a liability to your company. And as mayor, I can't, in good conscience, award a major city contract to someone who's shown such a blatant lack of professionalism and respect. The color drained from Doug's face, his bravado crumbling. You can't do that. That bid is locked in. You don't have the authority. James's tone sharpened, cutting through Doug's protests. Oh, I absolutely have the authority. And the last thing this city needs is a contractor who can't control his temper in public. Doug stumbled back, sinking onto the bench in his cell, muttering incoherently, "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." James took a step closer, his voice calm but relentless. "You've spent all night screaming about how important you are, about everything you've built. But tonight, the only thing anyone will remember is how quickly you tore yourself down." Doug's head snapped up, his face flushed with desperation. "Look, I didn't know who you were, okay? I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. You've got to give me a break here." James tilted his head, his tone razor-sharp. "A break, Doug? You didn't care who I was when you were shouting insults or throwing punches, and now you want me to care about your excuses?" The officer who had escorted James stepped forward. "Mayor Parker, the charges are finalized. We're ready for your signature to proceed." James nodded, stepping back from the bars. "Thank you, officer. Let's move forward." He turned to leave, but paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "By the way, Doug, you might want to consider a new line of work. Something tells me this city won't need your services anytime soon." Doug sputtered, his protests dissolving into incoherent frustration as James walked away. His voice echoed faintly behind him, but James didn't look back. As he exited the holding area, a faint, satisfied smile tugged at the corners of his lips. By the next morning, the video of the grocery store altercation was everywhere. Captured from multiple angles, the footage showed Doug yelling, shoving, and ultimately punching James. Every word, Doug's slurs, his unhinged accusations, his declarations about people like you ruining this country, was captured with stark clarity. The video ended with Doug pinned to the counter by security guards, the murmurs of shocked onlookers punctuating his humiliating downfall. By noon, major news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines like "Local Contractor Arrested for Assaulting Mayor" and "Caught on Camera, Racist Outburst Leads to Arrest" dominated television screens and social media feeds. Doug's enraged face became a viral spectacle, dissected in talk shows and online discussions. Commentators pointed out the bitter irony of his behavior, given his company's reliance on city contracts. As James scanned the news later that afternoon, he leaned back in his chair, his faint smile returning. Justice had been served, and the consequences of Doug's actions were now clear for the world to see. As the dust settled, the ripple effects of Doug's actions began to take shape. James's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from colleagues, friends, and community leaders offering their support. His press secretary had already prepared a statement, and by late afternoon, James stood confidently in front of City Hall. Though his jaw still bore the faint bruises of the encounter, his posture was steady, his composure unshaken. "What happened last night was unfortunate," James began, his voice measured and firm. "But it sheds light on a deeper issue we must all confront as a community. This is about more than one incident. It's about how we choose to treat one another and the accountability we must demand, not just as individuals, but as a society. I trust the justice system to handle this appropriately." Reporters wasted no time, peppering him with questions about Doug, the implications for Simmons Construction, and whether this incident would affect future city projects. James's response was deliberate and unwavering. The city holds contractors to the highest ethical standards. Professionalism and respect are non-negotiable. Based on last night's events, Simmons Construction's pending bid is now under review. The message was unambiguous. Doug's behavior was not just a personal failing, but a professional liability. By evening, the consequences were in full motion. Simmons Construction's website and social media pages were inundated with angry comments, calls for boycotts, and demands for accountability. Within hours, one of Doug's largest clients publicly terminated their contract, issuing a succinct statement. "We do not condone the behavior exhibited by Mr. Simmons and have chosen to sever ties immediately." Other clients quickly followed suit. By the next morning, the once thriving construction company was in a nosedive. Local businesses cut their ties, and Doug's business partners issued a public condemnation of his actions. The financial fallout was swift and unforgiving. Without the city bid or its major contracts, Simmons Construction faced insolvency. That evening, James attended a community fundraiser outside City Hall. Applause greeted him as he arrived, the crowd's admiration for his composure evident. Throughout the event, attendees approached him with words of encouragement. An older woman, her grip firm and her eyes brimming with gratitude, shook his hand. "Thank you for standing up to people like that," she said. "You showed us all how to handle hate with dignity." James smiled warmly and nodded. Sometimes, the best way to respond to anger is with calm. Letting someone reveal their true nature can speak louder than anything you might say in return. Meanwhile, Doug sat alone in his dimly lit office at Simmons Construction. The blinds were drawn, shutting out the protesters gathered outside. Their signs read, "No racists in our city," and "Hold Doug Simmons accountable." The rhythmic chants echoed faintly through the walls, a constant reminder of his fall from grace. Doug slammed his fist on his desk, the sound reverberating through the near-empty room. Most of his staff had called in sick or resigned outright, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. His phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from reporters, former clients, and even personal acquaintances. But he ignored them all, his focus fixed on the letter in his hand. His bank had suspended the company's line of credit, citing reputational risk. Without it, Simmons Construction couldn't sustain its ongoing projects. Doug stared at the letter, the words blurring together. The city bid had been his last hope, a multi-million-dollar contract that could have secured his company's future. Now, it was gone, and with it, any chance of redemption. Back at City Hall, James spent the evening at his desk, reviewing paperwork. The swift and decisive fallout from Doug's actions felt like progress, a sign that accountability was becoming less of an option and more of a necessity. Yet, beneath the satisfaction, a trace of sadness lingered. Not for Doug specifically, but for the broader implications of his behavior. The deep-seated attitudes Doug had displayed were a reflection of a problem much larger than one man. A notification lit up James's phone. A message from a local activist. "Thank you for standing up to hate. You inspire us to keep fighting." James set the phone down, a faint smile crossing his face. Leadership, he reminded himself, wasn't always about grand gestures or sweeping policies. Sometimes it was about how you responded in moments of trial, the choices you made when your character was tested. The next morning, Doug released a video statement from his office. His face was pale, his voice trembling, as he read from a prepared script. "I made mistakes," he began. "I let my anger get the best of me, and I deeply regret my actions. To Mayor Parker and the citizens of this city, I am truly sorry." But the apology fell flat. The public wasn't forgiving, and the comments under the video were scathing. Many accused Doug of insincerity, calling his statement a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. The damage had already been done. James watched the video later that day, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to respond. Doug's downfall had spoken volumes, illustrating the consequences of unchecked hatred and arrogance. In the weeks that followed, the media storm showed no signs of abating. News outlets replayed the grocery store footage on loop, dissecting every word and gesture. Doug's face became synonymous with public outrage, his behavior emblematic of attitudes the city was eager to leave behind. Meanwhile, Simmons Construction officially shut its doors. Protesters remained camped outside for days, their chants reverberating through the empty halls. The few employees who hadn't already resigned quietly disappeared, unwilling to be linked to the scandal. Clients severed contracts faster than Doug could respond, leaving him to face the collapse of his once thriving business alone. Preparations for Doug's trial began in earnest. He faced multiple charges, including assault, disorderly conduct, and verbal harassment. The mounting legal fees added to his grim prospects. The trial promised to be a public spectacle, with journalists vying for seats and commentators speculating on every detail. As both the victim and the mayor, James's role added a layer of complexity, yet his calm, measured demeanor continued to earn him respect. When asked by reporters whether he harbored any anger toward Doug, James responded with characteristic poise. "Anger solves nothing. I trust the justice system to handle this fairly, and my focus remains on serving this city." As the morning of the pre-trial hearing arrived, brisk fall air greeted the courthouse steps. Outside, protesters and supporters gathered in equal numbers, their signs and chants vying for dominance. On one side, placards demanded justice for James. On the other, a dwindling group held signs calling for forgiveness for Doug. But the contrast was clear. The tide of public opinion had long since turned. Outside the courthouse, tensions between Doug's dwindling supporters and the larger community reached a fever pitch. On one side, signs declared "Accountability matters" and "Justice for James." On the other, a smaller but vocal contingent clung to slogans like "Free Doug" and "This is a witch hunt." Doug shuffled into the courthouse, flanked by his lawyer and an assistant carrying a stack of documents. His once confident swagger had evaporated, replaced by hunched shoulders and darting, nervous eyes. Though his tailored suit fit well, it seemed out of place on a man so visibly worn down by the weight of his choices. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. James sat near the front with his legal team, composed and calm in a navy suit. The bruises from the incident had faded, but the memory remained sharp. Across the aisle, Doug fidgeted, his fingers tapping erratically on the table as he whispered in agitation to his lawyer. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. She was a stern woman with an air of authority, her piercing gaze sweeping over the courtroom before settling on Doug. "Mr. Simmons," she began, her voice steady and firm, "you are charged with assault, verbal harassment, and disorderly conduct. How do you plead?" Doug's lawyer rose, his tone measured. "Not guilty, Your Honor. My client intends to show that he acted under provocation and that the events have been misrepresented in the media." A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery, but James remained motionless, his expression unreadable. The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. "Very well. Given the public nature of this case, I am setting a trial date for 2 weeks from today. Both parties will present their evidence, and I will ensure this courtroom remains impartial." As her gavel fell, Doug shot a venomous glare at James. Unshaken, James met his gaze briefly before turning to confer quietly with his attorney. Outside, the marble steps of the courthouse became a swarm of reporters, microphones, and clicking cameras. Questions flew toward James as he exited. "Mayor Parker, how do you feel about the trial being so public? Do you believe Doug Simmons deserves jail time? Will this incident affect your political career?" James raised a hand, quieting the cacophony. "This trial is about accountability, not politics," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I trust the legal system to handle this fairly. My focus remains on serving the city, and I won't let one incident distract from that work." Meanwhile, Doug slipped out of a side entrance, avoiding the main crowd. Pulling his coat tightly around him against the cold wind, he walked briskly to a waiting car, his expression grim as he ignored the few cameras that had found him. Later that evening, James sat in his office at City Hall, reflecting on the day's events. The looming trial felt significant, not only for the personal justice it represented, but for the message it could send, that such behavior would no longer be tolerated, regardless of who it came from. Across town, Doug sat in his dimly lit apartment, his phone silent for the first time in years. The steady stream of emails, calls, and messages from clients had dried up, leaving an emptiness that mirrored his own growing despair. The television in the corner replayed clips of James's courthouse statement, but Doug muted it with a growl, burying his face in his hands. His lawyer had warned him of the likelihood of a conviction, given the overwhelming evidence against him. Yet, Doug couldn't shake the feeling that he was the victim, wronged by circumstances beyond his control. The trial began 2 weeks later, the courtroom packed with journalists, activists, and curious citizens. Rows of onlookers filled the gallery, eager to witness the proceedings. The judge presided with an unyielding demeanor, her authority commanding respect from everyone present. Doug sat at the defense table, his face tight with tension. His fingers tapped anxiously on the polished wood, the nervous energy of a man who knew the odds were not in his favor. Across the aisle, James sat with his legal team, exuding quiet confidence. His calm presence was a stark contrast to Doug's restless demeanor. The prosecution opened with a compelling statement, painting a vivid picture of Doug's actions on the night in question. "This is not a case of misunderstanding or poor judgment," the prosecutor began. "This is a case of deliberate aggression, fueled by prejudice and unchecked anger." The defendant not only verbally harassed Mayor Parker, but escalated his hostility to physical violence. Doug's lawyer countered, his tone measured but defensive. "This case is about context," he argued. "My client was provoked, subjected to an environment that led to an unfortunate lapse in judgment. He regrets his actions deeply and asks for your understanding." The first witness called to the stand was Kendra, the grocery store employee who had witnessed the entire altercation. Dressed professionally, she approached the stand with a composed and resolute demeanor. "Kendra," the prosecutor began, "can you describe what you saw that evening?" "Yes," Kendra replied, her voice steady. "Doug Simmons started yelling at Mayor Parker in the self-checkout area. He made several racist comments and got more aggressive when the mayor didn't respond the way he wanted. It wasn't long before he shoved him and then punched him." Doug's lawyer rose, his tone probing. "Kendra, would you say tensions were already high in the store that evening? Perhaps both parties were irritable?" Kendra didn't flinch. "No," she replied firmly. "The only one who was out of control was Mr. Simmons. Mayor Parker never raised his voice. He stayed calm the entire time." The prosecution then called several shoppers as witnesses, their testimony supported by the videos they had recorded during the incident. The footage, played on a large screen for the courtroom, showed Doug shouting, gesturing wildly, and ultimately striking James. The audio captured his words in chilling detail, each comment dripping with venom and malice. The room fell silent as the videos played, the weight of the evidence undeniable. The courtroom was silent, except for the harsh sound of Doug's voice echoing from the speakers. Each clip played out on the large screen, capturing his insults, slurs, and, finally, the punch that had brought the confrontation to its boiling point. The defense lawyer tried to reframe Doug's outburst as a moment of poor judgment rather than malicious intent, but the evidence was damning. Every new video, every witness account, painted a stark picture of a man consumed by unchecked anger and deep-seated prejudice. When Doug finally took the stand, the tension in the room thickened. He adjusted his tie nervously, his gaze flickering between the judge, the jury, and James. His once defiant demeanor had crumbled, leaving behind a man visibly worn down by the weight of his choices. "Mr. Simmons," his lawyer began, his tone measured, "can you tell us what was going through your mind that night?" Doug inhaled shakily, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I was frustrated. I'd had a bad day, and when I saw Mayor Parker, I didn't even know who he was. I let my emotions get the better of me. I'm sorry for what I said and did." The prosecutor rose, her expression sharp and unyielding. "Mr. Simmons, are you saying the racial slurs you used were the result of a bad day?" Doug hesitated, fumbling for words. "No, I didn't mean them. I was just angry. And the punch? Was that just a bad day, too?" The prosecutor pressed. Doug's shoulders slumped as he looked down, his voice barely audible. "I wasn't thinking." When James took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He maintained his characteristic composure, his voice steady and deliberate, as he recounted the events. "Mayor Parker," the prosecutor asked, "how did you respond to Mr. Simmons's verbal attacks that night?" "I remained calm," James replied simply. "I didn't engage with his insults because I didn't want to escalate the situation. My focus was on de-escalation. But unfortunately, Mr. Simmons chose to escalate it himself. The defense attorney attempted to paint James's calm demeanor as patronizing, suggesting it could have been perceived as condescending. James responded with quiet authority. Choosing to stay calm isn't condescension, it's restraint. I didn't want anyone to get hurt that night, including Mr. Simmons. The prosecutor's closing argument was concise and powerful. This case is about accountability, she began. Mr. Simmons's actions were deliberate, and they had consequences. No one is above the law. His position as a business owner does not exempt him from responsibility. The defense lawyer, visibly flustered by the overwhelming evidence, made a final plea for leniency. My client has learned from his mistakes. He deeply regrets his actions and asks for your understanding as he works to make amends. The jury deliberated for several hours, the tension in the courtroom palpable. Doug sat stiffly in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Across the room, James waited patiently, his calm demeanor unwavering. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson rose, clearing her throat before reading the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Douglas Simmons, guilty on all charges. The judge's gavel struck the wood, signaling the trial's end. Doug's shoulders sagged, the weight of the verdict pressing down on him as the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. James stood, gathering his papers with quiet efficiency. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed James as he stepped into the brisk air. Cameras clicked, microphones were thrust toward him, and questions flew. Mayor Parker, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think this sends a strong enough message? James paused, his voice firm but measured. Justice was served today. I hope this case reminds everyone that words and actions have consequences. We all have a responsibility to treat each other with respect, regardless of our differences. As James walked through the crowd, the reporters parted, their cameras following him until he disappeared into a waiting car. For Doug Simmons, the trial was over, but the consequences of his actions were just beginning. Alone in his dimly lit apartment, he sat slumped on the couch, surrounded by the detritus of his unraveling life. The once pristine space was cluttered with unopened mail, takeout containers, and empty beer bottles. The only light came from the flickering television, muted but replaying clips from his trial. The news anchor's voice cut through the silence in Doug's mind. Doug Simmons, the former owner of Simmons Construction, has been found guilty on all charges. His conviction marks the end of a man once considered a respected business figure, now a cautionary tale of unchecked anger and prejudice. Doug clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding audibly. Respected. That word echoed in his mind, taunting him. He had been more than respected. He had been successful, powerful. He built things, real things, and now, because of one incident, everything was gone. The thought filled him with a simmering rage. He grabbed an empty beer bottle and hurled it across the room, watching it shatter against the wall. The sound barely registered over the pounding in his ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the victim here. That smug mayor had turned the whole city against him. Doug stood abruptly, pacing the room as his thoughts spiraled. Revenge flickered in his mind, but every avenue he considered was blocked. His company was gone, his contracts canceled, his bank accounts frozen. The city had blacklisted him, and no one would return his calls. The few times he had ventured outside, he was met with glares, muttered insults, or outright confrontation. Even his closest allies had abandoned him. His business partners had issued a public statement condemning his actions, and his lawyer had stopped answering his calls the moment the trial ended. Doug was utterly alone, and he hated every second of it. His phone buzzed on the cluttered table. Expecting yet another hate-filled message or mocking meme, he snatched it up, prepared to hurl it as well. But what he saw on the screen made him pause. Doug Simmons stared at his phone, the glaring headline casting a harsh light on the wreckage of his life. Simmons Construction declares bankruptcy following court verdict. His hands trembled as he gripped the device, his rage simmering just below the surface. Bankruptcy. The word mocked him, reducing decades of work and ambition to a single, damning label. The company he had built from the ground up, His legacy was now synonymous with failure and disgrace. With a sharp motion, Doug slammed the phone onto the cluttered desk. His breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps, his thoughts spiraling in search of someone to blame. James Parker, the store clerk, the bystanders with their phones. They were all complicit, conspiring to bring him down. They wanted him to fail, to revel in his humiliation. The idea solidified in his mind, feeding the toxic narrative he had constructed. He stormed to the desk and yanked open a drawer, rifling through its contents. Amidst old receipts and scattered office supplies, his fingers closed around a smooth, crisp business card. The name embossed on it seemed to shine mockingly under the dim light. James Parker, Mayor. He clenched the card tightly, crumpling it in his fist, as if crushing it could erase the man's existence from his life. Doug's mind churned with fantasies of confrontation. He imagined storming into City Hall, demanding an audience, and shouting James down in front of his staff. He pictured exposing James as the manipulator Doug convinced himself he was. But reality clawed its way back into his thoughts, cold and unyielding. Doug had no power left. No one would listen to him. The courts had spoken. The public had moved on. And James Parker was untouchable. The realization hit like a physical blow. Doug's knees buckled, and he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Silent rage shook his shoulders as he wrestled with a whisper of truth buried beneath layers of indignation. This wasn't anyone else's fault. The words, fragile and fleeting, tried to take root, but Doug crushed them under a familiar wave of denial. They pushed me to it. They forced my hand. For hours, Doug sat in his dimly lit apartment, lost in the toxic cycle of blame and bitterness. Outside, the world continued to move forward, his name slowly fading from the headlines, but never forgotten. He had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of unchecked anger and entitlement. But Doug refused to see himself that way, clinging instead to his hatred, plotting imaginary confrontations that would never happen. Meanwhile, across town, James Parker had returned to his work. His name, once linked to the confrontation, was now associated with dignity and leadership. The city had seen Doug Simmons for who he truly was and moved on, leaving him behind. In the weeks following the trial, the noise of Doug's downfall had been replaced with stories of progress and hope. The city seemed to breathe easier. Late one evening, James sat at his desk in City Hall, reviewing reports on ongoing community projects. The once contentious bid from Simmons Construction had been voided, the contract now awarded to a smaller, minority-owned firm with a reputation for quality and fairness. The decision had been widely praised, a symbolic commitment to the city's values of integrity and progress. James leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the city lights. His thoughts drifted to the events that had brought him to this moment: the grocery store, the trial, and the media frenzy. It had been exhausting, but it had also been necessary. A knock at the door pulled him from his reflection. Angela, his chief of staff, stepped in holding a folder. "Mayor Parker, these are the final reports on the Simmons case," she said, setting it on his desk. "Thought you'd want to see them." James nodded, taking the folder. "Thank you, Angela. Anything else?" Angela hesitated briefly before smiling. "Just a note. The city council wanted me to tell you how much they appreciate how you handled everything. It wasn't easy, but you set an example." James smiled faintly. "That's kind of them, but it wasn't just me. It was the community, the witnesses, the people who spoke up. They made it clear what kind of city we want to be." As Angela left, James opened the folder and skimmed its contents. The details were straightforward. Doug had been sentenced to community service and a hefty fine. His appeals were unlikely to succeed, given the overwhelming evidence against him. Simmons Construction was officially dissolved, and Doug's personal finances were in shambles. The once proud businessman had become a cautionary tale, defined not by his success, but by his fall. Across town, Doug sat alone in his apartment. The protests outside had stopped, but the silence was more damning. His phone sat untouched on the table, silent as his once busy life ground to a halt. Friends who had initially stood by him had slowly distanced themselves, unwilling to share in his disgrace. Scrolling aimlessly through social media, Doug winced at each post mocking him or dissecting his actions with cold detachment. Videos of the trial still circulated, accompanied by biting critiques. His hand trembled as he closed the app, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a physical force. The city had moved on, but Doug hadn't. His anger festered, his bitterness at James Parker growing more toxic with each passing day. Yet, beneath the layers of blame and denial, a small voice persisted, whispering the truth Doug refused to face. You did this to yourself. The realization flickered in Doug's mind, fragile and fleeting, before being drowned in another wave of indignation. The narrative he clung to, the belief that the world was against him, remained his armor against accountability. Alone in his apartment, surrounded by the remnants of his former life, Doug chose denial over growth, bitterness over redemption. Meanwhile, across town, James Parker found himself walking the aisles of the grocery store where it had all begun. The familiar hum of conversation and the soft beeping of registers filled the air, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere of that fateful night. As he moved through the store, shoppers smiled and nodded in recognition. Some stopped to offer quiet words of support, their gratitude a testament to the impact of his actions. At the self-checkout station, Kendra, the cashier who had witnessed the confrontation, approached him with a wide grin. "Mayor Parker," she greeted warmly, "it's good to see you again." James returned her smile. "Kendra, I hope things have been quieter since that night." She laughed softly, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fondness and respect. "Quieter, yes, but I'll never forget it. You handled yourself with so much grace. Not many people could have done that." James's expression grew thoughtful, his voice steady as he replied, "Sometimes the best response to anger is calm. Letting people reveal who they are can be more powerful than any argument." Kendra nodded, her admiration evident. "Well, I just wanted to say thank you for standing up for what's right and for showing everyone how to handle hate with dignity." As James paid for his items and stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted him. He paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the night sky where stars scattered like fragments of hope. The events of the past weeks, the confrontation, the trial, and Doug's downfall, played briefly in his mind. They were chapters in a story that had tested him, challenging his resolve and beliefs. But they had also reinforced his faith in the city's capacity for growth, accountability, and unity. Walking to his car, his phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from a young activist he had met during a recent community event. "Thank you for everything, Mayor Parker. You've shown us how to lead with strength and grace." A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Moments like this reminded him why he had taken on the responsibility of leadership. It wasn't just about policies, speeches, or the title. It was about being present, standing firm, and setting an example when it mattered most. Doug Simmons had fallen, brought down by his own unchecked anger and prejudice. His story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the destructive power of entitlement and hate. But James's focus wasn't on the past or Doug's failures. It was on the future and the people of his city who deserved leaders who embodied justice, integrity, and hope. Sliding into the driver's seat, James started the car. As the engine purred to life, he took a deep breath, his mind already shifting to the challenges ahead. The road wasn't easy, but moments like these reaffirmed his commitment. Leadership, he knew, was about guiding others through the storm and toward the light of progress. With that thought, James drove into the night, ready to face whatever came next, his resolve as steady as the stars above.